Prince spent 37 years fighting for something most artists never even knew they had lost: his master recordings. I spend most of my time reading contracts other people signed and later regretted. Recording deals, publishing splits, the fine print that decides who gets rich and who just gets famous. One name sits at the top of that pile: the cautionary tale and the folk hero at once: Prince. In 2014, after nearly 4 decades at war with Warner Brothers Records, he finally won back ownership of his master recordings, the one thing he had chased his whole career. He had 2 years left to live and no will. This is the economics of Prince. 37 years before he owned those masters, Prince Rogers Nelson was a teenager in a rented studio in Sausalito, California, cutting a debut album called For You almost entirely by himself. He played every instrument on it. He wanted one thing from a record label, and it was not money. It was control. In 1977, a Minneapolis manager named Owen Husney walked him into Warner Brothers Records and negotiated something almost unheard of for an unknown: a 3-album deal, described at the time as one of the largest ever handed to an untested artist, with the right for Prince to produce himself. That last part is the one that mattered to him, and it carried real money. A producer earns points on a record, a slice off the top, and label money almost never lets a teenager produce his own debut. Husney got it anyway. Here is where the sourcing has to be honest. The rest of the terms are disputed. Some accounts put Prince's advance at $80,000. Others just call it a 6-figure contract. His age at signing gets reported as 17, 18, and 19, depending on who is telling it. What every version agrees on is the trade Prince made. He took a smaller check than he could have chased somewhere else, and in return he got the studio keys. He would produce his own records before he was out of his teens. At the time, that felt like winning. But there was a line in that contract, the same line buried in almost every major label deal of the era, that Prince either did not fully weigh or could not yet change. Prince owned his songwriting. He did not own his masters. And those are two very different things, so it is worth being precise about them. The songwriting is the composition, the melody, and the words on paper. The master is the actual recording, the specific take that gets pressed onto vinyl, streamed, and licensed into films and commercials. Own the composition, and you earn a little every time someone else covers your song. Own the master, and you own the record itself, the exact thing people buy and stream, and you earn every time it gets used, effectively forever. For Prince, the master is the asset that keeps paying, the one that appreciates, and Warner Brothers Records owned Prince's masters. Every one of them. Purple Rain, 1999, When Doves Cry. The catalog that would go on to sell tens of millions of copies sat on Warner's books as a financial asset, not on the books of the man who wrote it, played it, and produced it. Here is the quiet arithmetic of that arrangement. Every time Purple Rain got licensed into a film, reissued, or later streamed, the ownership value flowed to the company that held the master. Prince earned as a writer and a performer. He did not own the thing itself. For most artists, that trade is invisible, because most artists never sell enough for it to matter. Prince sold enough for it to matter more than almost anyone. He would look back on that 1977 signing and wish he had read one clause differently. At the time, it was just the price of getting in the door. Almost no one ever heard the part that came next. By the early 1990s, Prince was one of the biggest artists on earth, and Warner did not want to lose him. So in 1992, they offered a new contract that made headlines everywhere: a reported $100 million. According to UPI's report that September, it was the richest deal ever handed to a solo artist, topping the roughly $60 million deals that Michael Jackson and Madonna had each just signed. On paper, Prince had won 6 albums, a 25% royalty, the title of vice president at Warner Brothers Records with a seat on the board and an office at their headquarters. His own label, Paisley Park Records, upgraded from a vanity imprint into a real joint venture. If you only read the headline, this is the moment the kid from Minneapolis beat the machine. And if that headline number had been the whole story, Prince might have retired a contented man. But then you read the fine print. That $100 million was a ceiling, not a guarantee. The $10 million advance for each new album only triggered if the previous album had shipped 5 million copies. His 1991 record, Diamonds and Pearls, was a genuine hit, and even it came in at 2 times platinum in the United States, around 2 million copies. That is a big album. It is also well under the 5 million the contract wanted, and most of the catalog around it did worse. To actually collect the full 100 million, all 6 albums would need to move 5 million units each, back to back, at a moment when the whole industry was shifting under him. That is the kind of number that does not survive contact with reality. So the biggest solo record deal in history was in practice a maximum he would almost certainly never reach. The vice president title came with an office at the Warner headquarters and a seat on the board, and it was mostly ceremonial. So yeah, not great, and worse than the money was the mechanism underneath it. The bigger advance did nothing to touch the one thing that had bothered him since he was a teenager. Warner still owned the masters. The new deal made the number on the front page bigger and left the ownership exactly where it had always been. This is the part where I stop reading the contract like an accountant and ask you to sit with what it actually felt like. Imagine being told you are the highest paid musician alive and slowly realizing the figure is mostly a mirage. Then imagine the label that owns your name on the album cover and every master you have ever recorded, deciding that you release music too often and telling you to slow down. That is what happened. Warner worried that Prince would flood the market and dilute the value of the catalog they owned, so they moved to control how much he could put out. To Prince, the message was simple. They owned the work, and now they wanted to own the pace of the work, too. So he did something no artist of his stature had done. In 1993, he changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol, the one people started calling the love symbol, walking away from the brand name that Warner had spent 15 years building and trademarking. And from 1993 through 1996, he appeared in public, on stage, and at award shows, with the word slave written across his cheek. The most successful artist of his generation, calling himself a slave to a record contract. It was theater. It was also, underneath, a balance sheet argument. He was telling the world he did not own the thing he made. The real question was what he could actually do about it. What he did was print his own way out. He kept recording, fast, stockpiling songs so that every album he handed over ran down the clock on the Warner contract instead of extending it. That is a documented strategy, not a rumor. He was spending down the deal on purpose. In 1996, the year he finally fulfilled that contract, he released Emancipation, a triple album, 36 songs, 3 full hours of music, put out through his own NPG records and distributed by EMI. The title was not subtle. He was free of Warner after 18 years. But freedom in 1996 came with a bill attached. Walking away from a major label meant walking away from the machine that put your record in every store and on every radio station in the world. Prince now had to fund his own operation, his own distribution, his own marketing. He would spend the back half of his career as a working touring musician, in part because independence is expensive, and the road is where an artist who owns his own show actually gets paid. He had traded the label's muscle for the label's leash. And here is the piece that stings. He still did not own the old masters. Purple Rain still belonged to Warner. He had escaped the contract. He had not won back the catalog. If you like watching the money get followed all the way down to who really owns what, take a second and subscribe. That is the entire channel. Now, back to the masters. Up to this point, Prince had been fighting to get out. Now the fight changed shape. He did not just want out. He wanted the masters back. And this stopped being a story only about Prince. Across the whole industry, a copyright clock was ticking. Section 203 of the Copyright Act of 1976 gives creators the right to reclaim rights they granted to a label or publisher, starting 35 years after the grant was made. The critical distinction is that this termination right only applies to recordings that were not made under a work-for-hire arrangement, meaning recordings where the artist was a true independent creator, not a commissioned employee of the label. Prince's early Warner recordings qualified. For Prince, that window was coming due on his earliest and most valuable recordings, the ones from the run that built him. On April 18, 2014, after 18 years apart, he and Warner Brothers Records signed a new deal. This time, he got the thing the teenager had signed away. Ownership of his master recordings reverted to him. In exchange, Warner got to remaster and reissue the catalog, beginning with the 30th anniversary edition of Purple Rain, and kept global distribution rights. Rolling Stone and Variety both reported it as the end of one of the loudest contract fights in the history of music. Prince had finally done it. He owned his masters. That was 2014. In April 2016, he died at Paisley Park. He was 57 years old, and he left no will. You would think a man that meticulous about ownership, A man who wrote the word slave on his face over exactly this issue would have written down who gets it all. He did not. There was no will. A Minnesota bank called Bremer Trust stepped in as temporary administrator within days of his death, and in early 2017, the court handed permanent control to Comerica Bank and Trust. Neither of them was Prince. The most controlling artist of his generation had at the end no say at all in who ran his estate. And then came the fight nobody could win, which was the fight over what he was even worth. Comerica, the administrator, valued the estate at around $82.3 million. The IRS looked at the same assets and came back with a number close to $163.2 million, nearly double. In a June 2020 notice, the tax agency claimed the estate owed an additional $32.4 million in federal taxes, plus a $6.4 million penalty for undervaluing it. The single biggest thing they fought over was the value of Prince's name and likeness, an asset that barely existed on paper and was worth tens of millions in reality. It is worth noting that the same tax court judge, Mark Holmes, oversaw a nearly identical dispute over the Michael Jackson estate's valuation, where the IRS and the estate were again separated by tens of millions of dollars on intangible assets like name and likeness. Two of the most controlling, most ownership-obsessed artists of their era, both ending up in the same courtroom over the same question of what a name is actually worth. Think about what that argument actually was. Two rooms full of experts, unable to agree within $80 million on the worth of a man who spent his life obsessed with owning his own worth. They finally settled in early 2022 on a valuation of $156.4 million, with the IRS dropping the $6.4 million penalty. The trial was called off just before it was set to start, in March of that year. 6 years, a small army of lawyers and appraisers, and a tax bill measured in tens of millions, all to answer a question a single signed document could have closed in an afternoon. That gap is the entire cost of dying without instructions. If Prince had left a will, this would be a very different story. With no will, Minnesota law split the estate among his siblings, his sister, Tyka Nelson, and 5 half-siblings. Over the years that followed, 3 of them sold their stakes to Primary Wave, a music rights company that had been buying up catalogs across the industry. According to reporting from Billboard and the Wall Street Journal, Primary Wave's acquisition of those shares brought their stake to roughly 42% of the estate. When the dust settled, the estate came to rest with Primary Wave as the largest single shareholder and the remaining heirs and their families holding the balance. Prince spent his life making sure a corporation could not control his work. Within a few years of his death, a corporation owned roughly half of it anyway. So here is the autopsy. Prince won. After 37 years, he pried his masters out of Warner Brothers Records, the fight that had defined his entire career. Then he lost, because owning your masters means nothing if you never say who gets them. He beat the label. Then he handed the single biggest decision about his life's work to a Minnesota probate court, for the simple reason that he never wrote it down. A word on the numbers, because on this channel the tiering is the point. The 1977 advance and Prince's age when he signed are genuinely disputed across sources, so I gave you the range instead of picking the most dramatic version. The $100 million figure was a reported headline and a contractual ceiling, not a confirmed payout, and I flagged it that way every time. The estate valuations, $82.3 million from Comerica, roughly $163.2 million from the IRS, and the $156.4 million figure they settled on in 2022 are all documented in the public court and tax record. Where the sources disagreed, I told you they disagreed. That teenager in the Sausalito studio traded a bigger check for control of the record. It took him almost 40 years to win back the ownership he had signed away. He lost the final say over it by leaving no will. That is the pattern this channel keeps finding. The contract is never just the number on the front page. It is the clause on page 40 about who owns the master, and the document that never got written about who inherits it. If you want the money story behind the music you already love, subscribe, and we will keep reading the fine print. Prince fought his whole life to own his masters. He won that fight with 2 years to spare, and he never wrote down who it was all for.